When Grace stepped into that mansion as a dance teacher, she never expected the lonely boy upstairs would change everything. But it wasn't just little Andrew who fell for her gentle spirit. His billionaire father was watching from the shadows, and what happened next shocked them all. Before we dive into this incredible love story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because you won't want to miss how this beautiful dance teacher melted a cold billionaire's heart. Trust me, this story will make you believe in love again. I need you to imagine walking into the most beautiful penthouse you've ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, marble floors that gleam like mirrors, and artwork that probably costs more than most people's houses. That's exactly what Grace Washington felt when she stepped into Victor Sterling's world for the first time. She was 28, graceful as her name suggested, with warm brown eyes and a smile that could light up the darkest room. She'd been teaching dance for 6 years, mostly to kids from her neighborhood. But this job was different. This was about to change her life forever. Grace clutched her small dance bag tighter as the butler led her through hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. She'd never been inside a place like this before. Her own apartment could probably fit in just the entryway, but she wasn't here for the luxury. She was here for a little boy who needed her help. Andrew Sterling was 8 years old, and according to the phone call she'd received, he needed private dance lessons. What they didn't tell her was why. The butler knocked on a door and opened it to reveal the most magnificent room Grace had ever seen. It had been converted into a dance studio, complete with mirrors, ballet bars, and a sound system that probably cost more than her car. But what caught her attention wasn't the expensive equipment. It was the small boy sitting in the corner, looking lost and fragile. Andrew had his father's dark hair and serious eyes, but where Victor Sterling commanded rooms with his presence, his son seemed to shrink into himself. "Hello, Andrew," Grace said softly, kneeling down to his level. "I'm Grace. I hear you want to learn how to dance." The boy looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his age. "My mommy used to dance," he whispered. Before she got sick, Grace's heart broke a little. She'd been told that Andrew's mother had passed away 2 years ago, but she hadn't expected the pain to still be so raw. "Would you like to learn some of the dances she loved?" she asked gently. For the first time, Andrew's face lit up with something close to hope. "Really? You could teach me mommy's dances?" "I would be honored to," Grace replied, and she meant every word. What Grace didn't know was that Victor Sterling was watching from the doorway. He'd intended to just drop in, meet the dance teacher, and leave. He was a busy man running a real estate empire worth billions, and he didn't have time for small talk. But something about the way this woman spoke to his son made him pause. Andrew hadn't shown interest in anything since his mother died. He'd tried therapists, tutors, even expensive toys, but nothing had worked. Yet here was this stranger, and within minutes, she had Andrew actually smiling. Victor stepped into the room, and Grace looked up to see a man who commanded attention without even trying. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with perfectly styled dark hair and eyes that seemed to see right through you. His suit probably cost more than Grace made in 3 months, and everything about him screamed power and money. But there was something else, a sadness that he tried to hide behind his serious expression. "Mr. Sterling," Grace said, standing up gracefully, "I'm Grace Washington. Thank you for hiring me to work with Andrew." Victor shook her hand, and for a moment, something passed between them. Her hand was warm and soft, and she met his eyes directly without the nervous flutter most people showed around him. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "I trust you understand this is a private arrangement. Andrew needs someone who can be patient with him." "Of course," Grace replied. "Every child learns at their own pace. We'll take it slow." Victor nodded curtly and turned to leave. But something made him glance back. Grace was already kneeling beside Andrew again, showing him how to position his feet for a simple ballet position. The boy was laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months, and Grace was smiling too. a genuine smile that transformed her entire face. "Daddy, look," Andrew called out. "Grace is teaching me first position. Mommy showed me this once." Victor felt his chest tighten. He'd almost forgotten that Andrew remembered those moments with his mother. "That's wonderful, son," he managed to say. As Victor finally left the room, he couldn't shake the image of Grace's gentle hands guiding his son, or the way her presence seemed to fill the space with warmth. He told himself it was just relief that Andrew was finally responding to someone. But deep down, he knew it was something more, something that scared him more than any business deal ever could. That first lesson lasted an hour, but it felt like minutes. By the end, Andrew was attempting simple movements and asking when Grace would come back. As she packed her bag, she noticed Victor had returned to the doorway, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Same time next week?" she asked. "Yes," Victor said simply. But as Grace walked past him toward the door, he caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of spring mornings. It was a scent that would stay with him long after she left. Grace had no idea that she'd just met the man who would turn her world upside down. And Victor had no idea that the woman walking out of his penthouse was about to teach him something more important than any dance step: how to love again. Over the next month, something beautiful began to happen in that penthouse. What started as weekly dance lessons slowly transformed into the highlight of everyone's week, including Victor's, though he'd never admit it. Grace had this magical way of bringing life into rooms that had felt cold and empty for too long. She'd arrive each Wednesday at 4 o'clock sharp, always with a warm smile, and usually carrying a small bag of homemade cookies that made the entire apartment smell like home. Andrew had completely transformed. The quiet, withdrawn boy who barely spoke was now chattering excitedly about plie positions and grand jetés. He'd practice his steps in the hallway, calling out, "Grace taught me this," to anyone who would listen. But it wasn't just the dancing. It was the way Grace made him feel seen and valued. She remembered everything he told her, from his favorite color to the stories about his mother that he'd share in whispered voices during their cool-down stretches. Victor found himself making excuses to be around during those Wednesday lessons. He'd claim he needed to grab something from his office, or that he had to check on Andrew, but really he was drawn to the sound of laughter echoing through his home. It had been so long since those walls had heard genuine joy. He'd lean against the door frame, watching Grace move with such natural grace that it took his breath away. She wore simple clothes, leggings and fitted tops that allowed her to move freely. But there was something about her that made everything else in the room fade away. One particular Wednesday, Grace noticed Victor lingering longer than usual. Instead of his typical 5-minute check-in, he'd been standing there for nearly 20 minutes, pretending to read emails on his phone. Andrew was practicing a routine they'd been working on, and Grace caught Victor's eye in the mirror. "Would you like to try?" she asked playfully, knowing full well that this powerful billionaire would never agree to dance. Victor looked up, startled. "I'm sorry." "Dancing," Grace said, with a smile that made his stomach flip. "Andrew's been asking if you remember any of the steps his mother taught you." For a moment, Victor's carefully constructed walls cracked. "She used to try to teach me," he said quietly. "I was terrible at it." "I bet you weren't as bad as you think," Grace said, extending her hand. "Come on, just a simple waltz. Andrew would love it." Before Victor could think of a reason to refuse, he found himself walking toward her. Her hand was warm in his, and when she placed her other hand on his shoulder, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with business deals or board meetings. "Just follow my lead," Grace whispered, and suddenly they were moving together. Victor was surprised by how natural it felt, how perfectly Grace fit in his arms. She smelled like vanilla and something floral, and when she looked up at him with those warm brown eyes, he forgot about everything else. "Daddy, you're dancing," Andrew squealed with delight, clapping his hands. "You look happy." Victor realized his son was right. For the first time in 2 years, he felt genuinely happy. Not the satisfied feeling of closing a deal or the brief pleasure of expensive things, but real deep-down happiness. And it was all because of the woman in his arms. The music ended, but Victor didn't step away immediately. Neither did Grace. They stood there for a moment, close enough that he could count the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough that he could feel her breath against his cheek. The air between them crackled with something electric, something that made his heart race in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice rougher than usual. "For what?" Grace asked, though her cheeks had turned the prettiest shade of pink. "For giving him back his smile," Victor replied. But they both knew he was talking about more than just Andrew. That night, after Grace left, Victor stood in his empty penthouse and realized something that terrified him. He wasn't just grateful for what Grace was doing for his son. He was falling for her, hard. And for a man who controlled billion-dollar empires, the complete lack of control over his own heart was the most frightening thing he'd ever experienced. Meanwhile, Grace drove home, with her heart pounding, replaying every second of being in Victor's arms. She'd never felt anything like the electricity that had passed between them, but she also knew the danger of getting involved with a client, especially one whose world was so different from hers. Still, as she fell asleep that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Victor had looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in his perfectly ordered world. But then Andrew said something that changed everything, and Grace realized she wasn't just fighting her feelings anymore, she was fighting for their future. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening, 2 weeks after that first dance. Victor had called Grace, his voice uncharacteristically nervous, as he asked if she'd join him and Andrew for dinner at their favorite little Italian place. "Andrew specifically requested you," he said, though Grace suspected there was more to it than that. She'd been thinking about him constantly since their dance, replaying the moment over and over like her favorite song. The restaurant was cozy and intimate, with soft lighting and the kind of atmosphere that made everything feel like a scene from a romantic movie. Andrew chattered excitedly about his progress, demonstrating ballet positions right there at the table, while other diners smiled at his enthusiasm. But Grace found herself stealing glances at Victor, watching the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at his son's antics, the way he unconsciously reached out to straighten Andrew's shirt with such tenderness. "Grace," Andrew said suddenly, his voice taking on that serious tone children use when they're about to say something important. "Are you going to be my new mommy?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Grace felt her cheeks flush hot, and Victor nearly choked on his wine. But Andrew continued, innocent and hopeful, "Because I asked God for someone to take care of us, and then you came. And Daddy smiles now when he looks at you, the same way he used to smile at Mommy." Grace's heart shattered and soared at the same time. She looked at Victor, who was staring at his son with a mixture of panic and something deeper, something that looked like longing. "Andrew," she said gently, "that's a very special thing to say, but grown-up relationships are complicated." "Not really," Andrew said, with 8-year-old wisdom. "You just have to love each other, and you do, right?" Later that evening, after they'd tucked Andrew into bed, Victor and Grace found themselves alone on the terrace of his penthouse. The city sprawled below them, twinkling like fallen stars, but all Grace could focus on was the man standing beside her. He'd been quiet since Andrew's question, and she could practically feel the thoughts racing through his mind. "I'm sorry about what he said," Victor began, but Grace shook her head. "Don't apologize for him being hopeful," she said softly. "He's been through so much. If believing in something beautiful helps him heal, then I'm honored to be part of that." Victor turned to face her fully, his eyes intense in the moonlight. "And what about you? What do you believe in?" Grace's breath caught. They were standing so close now, close enough that she could see the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. "I believe," she whispered, that sometimes the most unexpected things turn out to be exactly what we need. That's when Victor cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I haven't felt this way since. I didn't think I could feel this way again." "Neither did I," she admitted, leaning into his touch. When their lips met, it was like the world shifted on its axis. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but then deeper, filled with weeks of suppressed longing and the promise of something beautiful. Grace felt herself melting into him, her hands clutching the front of his shirt, as if she were afraid he might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Victor rested his forehead against hers. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words barely audible. "So am I," Grace whispered back. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe the best things in life are worth being scared for." Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. Victor would text Grace good morning messages that made her smile throughout her day. He'd send flowers to her studio, not expensive, showy arrangements, but simple bouquets of daisies and sunflowers that reminded him of her smile. Grace would leave little notes in Andrew's dance bag, messages that were really meant for Victor, telling him about her day or sharing something that made her think of him. Their first real kiss had opened a floodgate of emotions neither of them had been prepared for. They were falling in love, not the desperate, frantic kind of love, but the deep, soul-stirring kind that changes everything. And as scary as it was, as much as it challenged everything they thought they knew about their lives, neither of them could imagine going back to the way things were before. Grace knew she was no longer just Andrew's dance teacher. She was becoming part of their family, part of their healing, part of their future. And that realization was both the most wonderful and most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. Just when everything seemed perfect, the universe decided to test them. It happened on a Tuesday morning when Grace arrived at the penthouse for Andrew's lesson, only to find a woman she'd never seen before sitting in the living room like she owned the place. She was everything Grace wasn't. Tall, blonde, dripping in designer clothes that probably cost more than Grace's monthly rent. But what made Grace's heart stop was the way she was touching Victor's arm, the familiar way she laughed at something he said. "Oh," the woman said when she noticed Grace, her voice carrying that particular tone wealthy people use when they're trying to sound polite, but really aren't. "You must be the dance teacher." Grace felt something cold settle in her stomach. "I am. I'm here for Andrew's lesson." Victor looked up, and Grace saw something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or regret. "Grace, this is Catherine." "Catherine." "Grace Washington." Catherine smiled, but it never reached her eyes. "Victor's told me so much about you. How wonderful that you're helping little Andrew through his grief period." Grief period. Like losing his mother was just a phase he'd get over. Grace felt her protective instincts flare, but before she could respond, Catherine continued. "Victor and I were just discussing our trip to the Hamptons this weekend. It'll be so nice to get back to our old routines." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Our old routines. This wasn't just any woman. This was someone from Victor's past, someone who clearly expected to be part of his future. Grace excused herself, mumbling something about needing to prepare for Andrew's lesson. But her hands were shaking as she set up the sound system. Throughout the lesson, Grace could hear Catherine's laughter echoing from the living room, could hear her talking about mutual friends and social events that Grace would never be part of. Andrew seemed subdued too, shooting worried glances toward the door. "Is that lady going to live here now?" Andrew asked quietly during their cool-down stretches. "I don't know, sweetheart," Grace said, her heart breaking for him. "You'll have to ask your father." After the lesson, Grace packed her bag quickly, desperate to escape. But as she headed for the door, she heard Catherine's voice, crystal clear and deliberately loud enough for Grace to hear. "Really, Victor, you can't let Andrew get too attached to the help. It's not healthy for him to form these dependencies." Grace stopped walking. The help. That's all she was to these people. She thought about all the late-night texts with Victor, the way he'd held her on the terrace, the way he'd whispered that he was falling in love with her. Had it all been just a temporary distraction for him? She made her decision that night. Grace called Victor and told him she was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Andrew's made wonderful progress, she said, keeping her voice professional. He's ready to continue with someone else. Grace, what's this about? Victor's voice was strained. Is this about Catherine? Because I can explain. You don't owe me any explanations, Grace said, even though each word felt like swallowing glass. We both knew this was temporary. But Victor Sterling didn't become a billionaire by giving up when things got difficult. Over the next week, he called Grace constantly. He sent flowers, he showed up at her studio, he even had Andrew call her, though she could tell the little boy was confused and hurt by her sudden absence. The breaking point came when Grace saw Andrew through her studio window, standing outside in the rain with Victor, holding a handmade sign that read, "Please come back." The little boy's face was streaked with tears, and Grace realized she wasn't just breaking her own heart, she was breaking his too. That's when Victor did something that shocked everyone who knew him. He organized a dance recital in the penthouse, inviting everyone from his business associates to Andrew's school friends. Grace arrived, thinking she was just picking up her final paycheck, only to find 50 people gathered in the main living room, all looking at her expectantly. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor said, his voice carrying that commanding tone she'd fallen in love with, "I want you to meet the woman who saved my family. Grace Washington isn't just a dance teacher. She's the person who taught my son to smile again, who taught me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real." Andrew ran to Grace, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I told Daddy that Catherine was mean, and that you're the one who makes us happy," he whispered. "And he said you're right." Victor walked toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Grace, I've spent 2 years thinking I had to choose between protecting my heart and opening it. But you taught me that the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." He dropped to one knee right there in front of everyone, pulling out a ring that caught the light like captured starlight. "Marry me, not because Andrew needs a mother, though he does. Not because I need someone to fill the empty spaces in this house, though I do. Marry me because I love you, completely and desperately, and I can't imagine a future without you in it." Grace felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at this powerful man kneeling before her, vulnerability written across every line of his face. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes. Of course yes." The room erupted in applause as Victor slipped the ring onto her finger and kissed her with everything he had. Andrew cheered the loudest, jumping up and down and shouting, "She said yes! She said yes!" 6 months later, Grace walked down the aisle of the very dance studio where she'd first taught Andrew, wearing her grandmother's pearl necklace and a dress that made her feel like a princess. Victor waited for her at the altar, Andrew beside him as best man, both of them crying happy tears. As they exchanged vows, Grace promised to love not just Victor, but the beautiful family they were creating together. And when they danced their first dance as husband and wife, Andrew joined them on the dance floor, and Grace knew that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Their love story had started with a simple dance lesson, but it had become something magnificent, a family built on love, trust, and the courage to believe in second chances. In the end, Grace had given Victor and Andrew exactly what they needed: a reason to dance again, a reason to love again, and a reason to believe that happy endings aren't just for fairy tales. They're for anyone brave enough to open their heart to the possibility of magic.